podcast with Relocate with Revenue podcast with Just and Jan.
Imagine you spend 4 solid months of the year, like January, February, March, and April, waking up early, sitting at your desk, taking endless meetings.
Oh, the constant meetings, yeah.
Right, dealing with all those client fires, just pouring all of your energy into your work.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that brutal 4-month sprint, your boss just takes your entire paycheck for that period, puts it in an envelope, and hands it directly to the government.
Just hands it right over.
You don't see a single cent of it. I mean, you wouldn't tolerate that, right? You would quit immediately.
Absolutely. Anyone would.
Yet, if you are an average working professional living in the United States, the UK, or Canada right now, that is exactly what is happening to you.
It really is a jarring reality, especially when you frame it in terms of actual time spent working.
Yeah.
I mean, we are so conditioned to look at our net pay, the amount that finally hits our bank account.
Accept it.
Exactly. We completely dissociate from the gross value of our labor. We just view that massive chunk taken out of our paychecks as like a fundamental law of the universe,
Right.
Something completely unavoidable.
And the mission for this deep dive is to shatter that exact illusion.
That's the goal.
We are pulling apart the global tax architecture today to show you how location-independent workers are legally and structurally keeping the vast majority of their revenue, instead of just, volunteering it to a system they barely use anymore.
Which is such a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. And we're basing today's entire strategic breakdown on the frameworks of Rowe. She's the founder of Relocate with Revenue, and you can actually find all her blueprints at relocatewithrevenue.com.
Her stuff is incredibly detailed.
Right. And her guiding premise is so simple but profound. It's basically income first, freedom always.
Which completely flips the standard narrative on its head, if you think about it.
How so?
Well, most people looking into this lifestyle, they start with the aesthetics, right?
Yeah.
They want the beach.
Oh, definitely. The laptop on the beach photo.
Right. They want the cobblestone streets in Europe.
Yeah.
But Rowe starts with the mathematics. Because the aesthetics are completely unsustainable if your financial engine is constantly being drained by an inefficient tax structure.
That makes total sense.
So today, we are focusing on her specific playbook, which is 0 tax countries for remote workers, the Geo-Arbitrage tax play.
Let's get right into that math then, because the baseline extraction she talks about is staggering.
Yeah, the numbers are heavy.
Rowe points out that when you combine federal income tax, state or provincial taxes, and those mandatory social contributions, the average worker in the US, UK, and Canada is losing between 23 and 35% of their income.
Up to 35%.
Yeah.
Just gone.
Let's make that real for a second.
Yeah.
If you generate $100,000 of value this year, up to $35,000 of it simply vanishes. That is gone before you pay your rent, before you buy a single week's worth of groceries, before you fund a vacation or, put away $1 for your own future.
And we should probably contextualize that a bit.
Yeah.
Because the 35% extraction feels heavy, but it is actually sort of the middle ground globally.
Wait, really? It gets worse.
Oh, yeah. If we look at the highest personal income tax rates around the world, Denmark is sitting at the absolute top.
Taking how much?
Taking roughly 55 to 60%.
60%. That is wild.
Yeah, and following closely behind are countries like France, Austria, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, and Sweden, all of which exceed a 50% top marginal rate.
I mean, if you are giving up 60% of your income, there has to be a profound psychological reconciliation with the state. Like, you have to genuinely believe you're getting 60% of your value back in social services.
You'd have to, right.
But for the vast majority of our listeners in North America and the UK, the focus isn't really on those European highs. The focus is on a much more insidious mechanism that is quietly draining their wealth, even if the headline tax rates never officially go up.
Ah, yes.
Rowe calls this fiscal drag, and I really want to tear this concept apart. How does fiscal drag actually work in practice?
Fiscal drag is arguably the most brilliant and frustrating mechanism built into modern economic systems.
Brilliant for the government, you mean?
Exactly. Here's the architecture of it. Tax systems operate on fixed income thresholds.
Okay.
These are the hard dollar amounts that determine which tax bracket your income falls into.
Right.
Well, the structural trap is that these thresholds do not automatically rise in lockstep with inflation.
Let's bypass the basic definition of inflation. Because if you are running a location-independent business or a make career right now, you already know what it feels like when your purchasing power drops.
You feel it at the grocery store every week.
Exactly. But let's look at the mechanics of the trap itself. Say I get a 5% raise this year and inflation is running at 5%.
Okay.
On paper, my lifestyle shouldn't change, right? I mean, I am making more actual dollars, but those dollars buy the exact same amount of goods as last year.
Right. Your purchasing power is totally flat.
But the tax system doesn't see it that way, does it?
No, it doesn't care about your purchasing power at all.
Yeah.
The tax code only looks at the absolute numerical value of your salary.
So they just see the higher number.
Exactly. So your salary goes up by 5% to keep you from falling behind on your bills. But because those fixed tax bracket thresholds haven't moved to adjust for that inflation, your newly inflated salary quietly pushes you across the threshold and into a higher tax bracket.
So my tax bill goes up. I am literally paying a higher percentage of my income to the government, even though my ability to actually afford my life hasn't improved one single bit.
That's exactly what happens.
I think the best way to visualize this is like being on a treadmill.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, you are running at a steady pace. You're
Yeah.
keeping up, but someone is quietly turning up the incline while you're not looking.
Yeah.
You have to run harder, you're sweating more, your heart is pounding, but you are staying in the exact same place on the machine.
It is the perfect analogy
Mm-hmm.
because the government is the one controlling the incline,
Right.
And here is the core takeaway regarding fiscal drag. Your salary is doing the tax raising work for the government.
Wow.
Yeah. They collect significantly more tax revenue from the population without ever having to announce a tax hike.
So no press conferences.
No press conferences, no legislative battles. They just let inflation and your necessary cost of living adjustments organically pull you into higher taxation.
It's a stealth tax. It really is.
Yep.
But before we just label the entire system as inherently malicious, we need to look at why it was built this way. Because M. Rowe provides some vital historical context here in her deep dive.
She does.
This structure wasn't designed to trap digital nomads, right? It was designed for a 20th century blueprint that just doesn't apply to us anymore.
Exactly. When these taxing structures were architected decades ago, they were built for a deeply stationary population.
Meaning people didn't move around much?
Right. The assumption was that a person lived in one specific geographic area. They worked at the factory or the office downtown. They spent their income at local businesses.
They bought their groceries down the street.
Yeah, they built their wealth in that specific community, and they eventually retired in that exact same zip code.
And so that 35% extraction was the fuel for a highly localized machine.
Exactly.
It paid for the physical roads you drove on to get to that office. It paid for the local municipal schools your kids went to. It funded the local hospital you used and the local pension structures. It was a closed loop.
A completely closed loop, but the paradigm shifted radically. I mean, we're operating in 2026. The technology exists to decouple your income entirely from your physical location.
Yep.
We have this massive growing demographic of remote workers, expat retirees, and location-independent business owners. And their economic footprint is completely untethered from their home country's local infrastructure.
Which brings us to a critical turning point in M. Rowe's philosophy. She states quite clearly, the moment you become a different type of person, that's when the rules change.
That is the pivotal realization.
Let me push back on that a bit, though, or at least, play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
If I am an American or Canadian remote worker and I decide to spend 8 months of the year bouncing between Southeast Asia and South America, I am obviously not using the local roads in my home country. I am not putting kids in the local school system.
Right.
But am I not still benefiting from the macro infrastructure, like the military protection, the passport strength, the diplomatic networks? Is M. Rowe essentially arguing that we are subsidizing a system we simply no longer participate in?
It's a completely fair question, and the answer is nuanced. Yes, you retain some macro benefits of citizenship, obviously.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of tax revenue does not go to diplomatic networks. It goes to the day-to-day municipal, provincial, and localized federal infrastructure that you have entirely opted out of using.
Ah, okay.
A friction M. Rowe is highlighting is that the antiquated taxing infrastructure continues to siphon your money at the maximum rate simply because you were born there, or previously resided there, regardless of your actual physical and economic footprint.
Because the system hasn't caught up.
The system has absolutely not caught up to the reality of the location-independent worker.
Which naturally leads to the ultimate question. If the system is broken for my lifestyle and I work entirely from my laptop, can I just pack my bags, fly to a new country, and stop paying?
That is the dream, right?
It is. But the answer to that is wild because it entirely depends on the color of your passport.
Yep.
We have to unpack this massive global divide. Residency taxation versus citizenship taxation.
This is the foundational knowledge required for any geo-arbitrage strategy. We have to start with the global norm.
Okay, what's the norm?
For almost every single country on Earth, and this explicitly includes the UK and Canada, the tax system is based on residency.
Okay, so if I am a British citizen and I've had enough of the fiscal drag and I officially move my life abroad, what are the mechanics of that? I don't just disappear, right?
No. You have to follow strict legal protocols to sever your residency.
Okay, so paperwork.
Lots of it. But if you leave and properly restructure your tax residency according to HMRC's legal requirements in the UK or the CRA in Canada, your tax obligation to your home country generally ends.
It just ends.
Or it is reduced to only income generated physically within their borders. Like if you have a rental property you left behind.
Sure, that makes sense.
But your global remote income, you are no longer a resident, you are no longer using the infrastructure, therefore you are no longer subject to their primary tax net.
That makes total logical sense. I don't live there, I don't consume the resources, I don't pay. That is the standard for the entire planet.
Right.
But then we get to the United States.
There we go.
And this is where MRO drops the absolute ultimate outlier. If you are an American listener, you cannot afford to misunderstand this. The U.S. does not play by the global rules of residency taxation.
It absolutely does not. The United States, along with Eritrea, are the only two countries on the planet that tax their citizens on their worldwide income, regardless of where they live.
Wait, I really want to dig into the why here. Out of nearly 200 countries, why is the U.S. paired with Eritrea on this? How did this even start?
It's crazy, isn't it?
It feels so inherently contradictory to the idea of a free, mobile society.
Well, the historical origin of this is actually fascinating, and it's vital to understanding the psychology of the system. U.S. citizenship-based taxation traces its roots all the way back to the Civil War.
The Civil War? Are you serious?
I'm completely serious. Specifically, the Revenue Act of 1861.
Wow.
During the war, the Union needed massive amounts of capital to fund the military. But wealthy individuals were fleeing the country, going to Europe, mainly...
To avoid the draft, I'm guessing?
Exactly. To avoid both the draft and the war taxes.
Oh, wow. So they were essentially dodging the war effort entirely.
Yep. So the government implemented a tax based on citizenship, specifically to target those wealthy draft dodgers.
Okay.
It was a punitive measure, designed to ensure that if you held the privilege of an American passport, you could not simply sail to Paris to avoid paying for the survival of the nation. It was a wartime emergency measure.
And yet here we are in 2026.
Here we are.
Over 160 years later, and that wartime emergency measure meant to punish Civil War draft dodgers is currently trapping a 28-year-old freelance graphic designer who just wants to live in Lisbon.
That's exactly what's happening.
That is unbelievable, and it leads to a very dangerous assumption that M. Rowe warns about. Americans watch videos of Canadians or Germans moving to Bali and living tax-free, and they assume they can do exactly the same thing just by getting on a plane.
It is the most costly assumption an American can make.
I bet.
If you are a U.S. citizen, the IRS follows you. Crossing a border does not sever your tax obligations.
It's not a magic line.
Not at all. If you simply leave and don't structure your life meticulously, you could end up in a nightmare scenario.
Like double taxation.
Exactly. Where you are paying local taxes to your new country and continuing to pay U.S. federal taxes on the exact same income.
Okay, so the IRS is this inescapable shadow. That sounds really bleak. But the entire premise of M. Rowe's relocation blueprint isn't to scare you, right? It's to arm you.
Yes, absolutely.
So what are the legal, verifiable tools available to an American remote worker right now to protect their revenue?
The primary defense, what Emro describes as the single most powerful legal tax tool available to an American abroad, is the foreign earned income exclusion, which is known as the FEIE.
The FEIE. We are going to meticulously deconstruct this. I don't just want the definition, I want the deep mechanics of how this works.
Yeah.
What is the baseline power of this tool in 2026?
Okay, so in 2026, the FEIE allows a qualifying American living abroad to completely exclude roughly $130,000 of their earned income from U.S. federal income tax.
$130,000.
Roughly, yeah. And MRO always highlights that this figure adjusts annually for inflation.
Okay, so if I earn exactly $130,000 from my remote consulting business, and I qualify for the FEIE, my federal income tax bill on that money goes to zero.
Precisely. That entire amount is completely shielded from the federal income tax net.
But I know there's fine print. This isn't a magic wand where you just stop filing paperwork.
Oh, absolutely not.
What are the major traps people fall into when they try to use the FEIE?
There are three critical caveats that require meticulous structuring. First, the FEIE only shields you from federal income tax.
Okay.
It does not shield you from state taxes if you haven't properly severed your state residency, which is a whole different complex process depending on the state you left.
Right. I know if you try to leave from California or New York, they fight tooth and nail to keep you in their state tax net, even if you are in Europe.
They really do. You have to be so careful.
What's the second trap?
The second caveat is absolutely vital for the entrepreneurs and freelancers listening. The FEIE does not cover self-employment tax.
Wait, really?
Really. If you are a sole proprietor or an independent contractor, you are still subject to the roughly 15.3% tax that funds Medicare and Social Security.
So even if I exclude the federal income tax?
Even if your federal income tax is zeroed out, that self-employment tax will hit you incredibly hard, unless you have a properly structured offshore corporate entity.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the kind of deep architectural work MRO outlines in her materials.
That is a massive distinction. You could think you are fully shielded and suddenly get hit with a 15% bill on $130,000.
It happens all the time.
And the third caveat.
The third is that the exclusion is not automatic. The IRS doesn't just guess that you're in Spain and stop looking for your money.
You wish.
Yeah, right. You absolutely must file a U.S. tax return every single year and actively claim the exclusion using specific IRS forms.
So the paperwork doesn't end?
Never. But beyond the filing, we have to talk about what happens when you earn more than the $130,000 limit. This is a mechanism known as the stacking rule.
Ah, the stacking rule.
This trips up so many high earners. Let's really break the math down here.
Okay.
Because people assume the FEIE acts like a giant pair of scissors.
Right.
They think if they make $250,000, the FEIE just snips off the first $130,000, throws it in the trash, and leaves them with $120,000.
That's the common assumption, yeah.
And they assume that remaining $120,000 is treated as if it were their only income, starting at the very lowest 10% tax bracket.
Which is a brilliant way to describe the misconception. Because logically, that is how most people assume a deduction works, but that is not how the IRS stacking rule operates at all.
Exactly. MRO explains that the FEIE doesn't use scissors, it uses an invisibility cloak.
Yeah. Let's visualize the U.S. tax brackets like a long, steep staircase. Usually, you start on the bottom step where the rate is low, say 10%. As you earn more, you climb the stairs to the 22%, 24%, and 32% steps.
Right. Standard progressive taxation.
When you make $250,000 abroad, the FEIE throws an invisibility cloak over the first $130,000. You don't pay federal tax on it. But due to, and this is the crucial part, that invisible money still pushes you physically up the staircase.
It pushes you right up.
So when it's time to pay taxes on the remaining $120,000, you don't get to walk back down to the bottom step. You are standing way up high on the 24% or 32% step. You have to pay taxes on that remaining amount at the much higher marginal rates.
That is exactly how it works. The excluded income dictates the tax rate applied to everything above the threshold. So, if you are a high-earning tech worker making $300,000 remotely, the FEIE is incredibly valuable, but it is not a complete free pass. You will be paying top-tier marginal rates on the unexcluded portion.
And how do you actually qualify for this? I mean, I can't just take a 3-week vacation to Cabo, take my laptop, and claim the FEIE, right?
No, definitely not. There are two very strict legal pathways. The first is the physical presence test.
Okay.
This is a purely mathematical test. You must be physically present on foreign soil for 330 full days within any consecutive 12-month period.
Stop right there. 330 days, that leaves you exactly 35 days to be back in the United States.
Yep, 35 days.
That sounds incredibly isolating. I mean, think about the logistics of a normal human life. If you come back for 2 weeks for Christmas, a week for Thanksgiving, and a week for your mom's birthday, you are completely maxed out.
You're done.
You can't attend a spontaneous wedding. You can't fly back for an unexpected medical emergency without risking your entire tax strategy. How do remote workers actually manage the psychological toll of that just to save on taxes?
It is a massive psychological toll, and it's why MRO advocates so strongly for understanding the second pathway, which is the bona fide residence test.
Okay, what's that?
Well, the physical presence test is a blunt instrument. It's great for digital nomads who are constantly moving and don't settle down anywhere, but the bona fide residence test is for people who truly relocate.
How does that one work? Is it less about counting days?
Exactly. It's about establishing a legitimate, legally recognized tax residency in another country. It's qualitative, not just quantitative.
So proving you actually live there.
Right. You have to prove to the IRS that your true home, your economic center, your social life, your banking, your permanent housing has officially shifted to a foreign nation.
And if you do that,
If you achieve bona fide resident status, you actually have far more flexibility to travel back to the U.S. for business or family without constantly staring at a stopwatch, provided your actual home remains abroad.
okay, so let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture here. We have established that the FEIE is your shield against the U.S. government.
Yes.
But if I pack up and move to a lovely apartment in Berlin, and I use the FEIE to shield $130,000 from the IRS, what stops the German government from looking at me and saying, fantastic, the Americans aren't taxing that, so we will gladly take 45% of it?
Nothing stops them.
Nothing.
And in a standard residency-based tax system like Germany or the UK or Australia, that is exactly what would happen.
Oh, wow.
You haven't solved the extraction problem. You have simply changed the flag of the country, extracting the money. Shielding your income from the U.S. is only half the battle.
Which brings us to the absolute core of MRO's strategy, the second layer, what she calls the dynamic Supertool.
This is where it gets really good.
Combining the U.S. FEIE with a country that operates on a territorial tax system.
Yes, the Geo-Arbitrage combo.
Let's define that.
We need to define territorial taxation very clearly. A territorial tax system is a highly specialized tax architecture used by only a select handful of countries globally.
Okay.
Unlike the U.S. or Germany, which tax your global income, a territorial tax system only taxes income that is economically sourced strictly within its own physical borders.
Let's apply this to a real-world scenario. Let's say I run a remote marketing agency. All my clients are based in New York, London, and Toronto.
Okay.
I move to a country with a territorial tax system. How do they view my revenue?
Well, because your clients, your contracts, and the source of your revenue are located outside of your new host country's borders. Their tax authorities look at your income and classify it as foreign-sourced.
And what does that mean for me?
Under a pure territorial system, foreign-sourced income is taxed at 0%.
So the local government takes nothing.
Nothing.
And concurrently, the U.S. government is looking at me and saying, well, you live abroad full-time and qualify for the FEIE, so we are excluding the first $130,000 from federal income tax.
That is the ultimate stacking play. Layer 1, the U.S. government blocks the federal tax on the first $130K. Layer 2, your new territorial home country refuses to tax the income because it is generated externally.
Wow.
The net result is that you legally, structurally, and verifiably keep the vast majority of your revenue.
You go from a baseline of losing 35% to keeping almost everything.
Exactly.
And it is so important to reiterate what MRO stresses here. This is not a shady back alley loophole. You aren't hiding cash in a duffel bag.
Not at all. These are explicitly written, publicly documented legal statutes in 2026.
Right.
The FEIE is a foundational piece of the U.S. tax code. Territorial taxation is the foundational law of these specific nations. You are simply operating with extreme efficiency within the established global rules.
Okay, the mechanics are undeniable. The theory is brilliant, but let's ground this in reality. Sure.
Where are we actually going? MRO provides a short list of destinations for 2026 that fit this precise criteria. Let's not just list them, let's debate the strategic trade-offs of these 4 key locations. Where do we start?
We have to start with Panama. It is the classic legacy standard for this strategy.
Okay, Panama.
Panama operates on a very robust, historically tested territorial tax model.
But Panama has a reputation, right? It's often viewed strictly as a corporate banking hub. If I am a solopreneur, what are the actual mechanics of setting up there? Do I just rent an apartment and the tax goes to zero?
It requires structure. M. Rowe details this heavily in her blueprints at relocatewithrevenue.com. You generally establish a Panamanian corporation, but the actual economic activity generating the revenue, like your marketing work for U.S. clients, must occur externally.
Okay, so you need the corporate setup.
Right. Panama is excellent for robust corporate structures, but the lifestyle trade-off is that it is a highly developed, somewhat expensive, heavily corporate environment in the city. Right. So if Panama is the corporate play, what if I want the lifestyle? What if I want nature, community, and a visa that actually understands remote work?
Then you look at the second country on her short list,
Yeah.
Costa Rica.
Costa.
It also operates under a territorial tax model, meaning your foreign-sourced income is generally protected. But Costa Rica is strategically massive right now because of a specific legal pathway they created, the Rentista visa.
Let's dive into the Rentista visa. M. Rowe notes it requires a baseline income of $3,000 a month in 2026. What are the actual logistics of this? How do I prove that?
You can't just show them a spreadsheet of your freelance income.
Obviously not.
You typically have to provide a certified letter from a bank or financial institution guaranteeing that you will receive $3,000 a month for at least 2 years.
Oh, so it requires capital proof.
Exactly. But if you clear that administrative hurdle, you achieve a legal, straightforward residency in a territorial tax system that explicitly targets the remote worker demographic.
It's a win-win.
They get your local spending in their economy, and you get to keep your tax rate near zero on your remote income.
Okay, so Costa Rica is the lifestyle play. But what if I don't care about the beach? What if I want the absolute lowest cost of living and I am purely focused on maximizing my revenue retention? Where does the mathematical geo-arbitrager go?
They go to Paraguay.
Paraguay.
This is the third country on the list, and M. Rowe calls it the overlooked darling of geo-arbitrage.
Yes.
It does not have the mainstream hype of Costa Rica. There are no massive digital nomad beach clubs.
Which is exactly why it's so powerful mathematically.
Exactly. Paraguay operates a territorial-style system with exceptionally low taxes, even on local income. And it currently offers highly favorable, practically zero tax treatment on foreign-sourced income.
Wow.
It is highly stable, the cost of living is incredibly low, and acquiring residency is relatively straightforward compared to European nations. It is a pure, unadulterated financial play for someone whose primary metric is revenue retention.
Fascinating. Now, the fourth country on her list breaks the mold entirely. M. Rowe is very clear that this is not a zero-tax territorial system.
Right.
But she includes it because it is incredibly attractive for a specific type of worker. We are talking about the country of Georgia, situated at the intersection of Eastern Europe and Western Asia.
Georgia is a brilliant strategic inclusion.
Yeah.
They do not use a pure territorial system. Instead, they recognized the paradigm shift in remote work and purposefully engineered a highly targeted tax regime to poach global talent.
Oh, interesting.
It's called the individual entrepreneur regime.
And the headline rate here is what blows my mind. 1%. Tell me how the 1% rate actually works in practice.
Well, if you are a remote worker or a sole proprietor providing services, say an IT consultant or freelance writer, you can apply for individual entrepreneur status.
Okay.
If approved, you pay a flat tax rate of exactly 1% on your gross annual turnover, up to a threshold of roughly $150,000 to $170,000 US dollars, depending on exchange rates.
Let's do the math on that. If I make $100,000 for my laptop, I pay the government of Georgia $1,000 total.
That's it, $1,000.
Compared to the $35,000 I was losing to the invisible siphon back in Toronto or Chicago, that is a life-altering amount of reclaimed capital.
It is massive. But M. Rowe emphasizes the operational reality here. You must actively apply and qualify for that status.
So it's not automatic.
It is not an automatic right just because you flew into Tbilisi. You have to ensure your specific business activities align with the approved categories. But if you fit, it is one of the most competitive tax architectures in the world.
So we have Panama, Costa Rica, Paraguay, and Georgia. But I noticed M. Rowe includes a very stark warning about a location that used to be the absolute gold standard for this community, the UAE, specifically Dubai. Why is Dubai now a cautionary tale?
This is a vital inclusion because it proves a macro point.
Right.
The goalposts move. Global tax rules are not static. They're highly dynamic. For decades, the UAE was famous for having absolutely zero personal and zero corporate income tax. It was a massive magnet for global capital.
Of course.
But recently, they introduced a 9% corporate tax.
Let me jump in there. 9% is still vastly lower than the 21% or 25% corporate rates in the US or the UK. So why is it such a big deal?
It's a big deal because it fundamentally alters the compliance architecture. It's no longer just move here and pay nothing.
Oh, I see.
Now, it involves highly complex rules regarding free zones versus mainland business, determining what qualifies as qualifying income, and dealing with transfer pricing rules.
Sounds like a headache.
MRO uses the UAE to illustrate that you cannot rely on outdated blog posts from 5 years ago. You must have current, specialized structural advice, or you will get caught off guard.
Which leads to the elephant in the room for this entire deep dive. If these legal, verifiable frameworks exist, if I can literally move to Costa Rica, use the FEIE, and legally keep an extra $35,000 every single year, why hasn't my local CPA ever mentioned this to me? Why did I have to find MRO's website to learn about Paraguay?
This is what MRO identifies as the systemic blind spot. And I really want to emphasize this. Your local CPA is not hiding this from you maliciously.
Right, it's not a conspiracy.
It all comes down to structural incentives and training. Your local accountant, whether they're sitting in an office in Seattle, Manchester, or Calgary, is highly trained to optimize your life within the matrix you are currently standing in.
Right. They are experts at finding the home office deduction. They know how to depreciate your company laptop under local tax codes.
Exactly. They are masters of managing your burden within the closed 20th century loop we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
They are absolutely not trained, nor are they financially incentivized to study the immigration laws of Paraguay, the territorial tax applications of Costa Rica, or the treaty tiebreaker rules between the U.S. and Georgia.
It's just outside their wheelhouse.
Cross-border taxation is a highly specialized, incredibly complex legal field. Your standard local accountant simply does not possess that toolkit.
And MRO puts a massive disclaimer on all of her materials regarding this. She provides the strategic framework, the blueprint of what is possible, but she insists that everything we are discussing requires an independent, cross-border expat tax professional to execute.
100%.
You cannot DIY this based on our deep dive today.
You absolutely cannot. The stakes are catastrophic if you get it wrong.
What happens if you get it wrong?
Well, one structural error, like misunderstanding how your specific state handles residency severance, or failing to file an FBAR for a foreign bank account, or misinterpreting the source of your dividends, can unravel the entire strategy and trigger massive compounding financial penalties.
Yikes.
You need an international tax architect to build this specifically for your bespoke situation.
Because everyone's life is messy. You might have a spouse from a different country, a mix of W-2 and freelance income, or property back home. But the core reality remains. The exit map exists. You just have to actively seek it out because the default system is designed to keep you on the treadmill.
Exactly.
And this brings us to the final concept MRO introduces, which completely shifts this from a conversation about tax math to a conversation about profound lifestyle design. It's a psychological metric she calls OCT. Break down OCT for us.
OCT stands for the opportunity cost of time.
Opportunity cost of time.
It is a foundational economic principle, but MRO applies it brilliantly to the way we consume information and plan our futures. OCT is the inherent value of what you could have achieved with your time if you hadn't spent it doing something else.
If I'm not doing this, what else can I be doing that actually moves the needle? I love that framing.
It's so powerful.
And she applies this directly to the content people consume when they dream about the expat lifestyle.
She draws a razor-sharp contrast. She points out that millions of aspiring remote workers spend countless hours watching standard travel blogs. Videos titled Apartment Hunting in Lisbon or A Day in My Life at a Bali Cafe.
We've all watched those.
And she isn't saying those are bad, but she is challenging the listener to evaluate the OCT of that consumption.
Because while you are spending 3 hours watching aesthetic drone footage of European beaches, you are not learning how the stacking rule decimates your high income.
Right.
You are not researching the banking requirements for the Costa Rica rentista visa. You are dreaming about the lifestyle, but you are completely ignoring the financial engine required to actually build and sustain it.
Exactly. MRO challenges her audience to run everything through that OCT metric. Are you walking away from a piece of content with actionable, bottom-line moving structural knowledge.
That's the real test.
Consuming a financial blueprint from a source like Relocate with Revenue.com has a massive return on the time invested, because it can literally alter the trajectory of your generational wealth.
Wow, yeah.
Watching a sunset travel vlog, while pleasant, has an incredibly high opportunity cost if it consistently replaces actionable strategic planning.
It is about living with intention and operating from a lens of strategic advantage. And honestly, this entire deep dive has been an exercise in minimizing our own OCT.
I'd say so.
We have spent this time deconstructing a system that passively extracts a third of your life's labor, and we've outlined the exact legal frameworks, the FEIE, territorial taxation, the nuances of the stacking rule that allow you to reclaim it.
It requires a fundamental shift in identity. You must move from a state of passive acceptance to a state of active architectural design.
I love that.
You do not have to accept a 35% tax extraction as an unavoidable reality of the universe simply because you happen to hold a specific passport. The power of residency structures and international tax law is fully available to anyone willing to build a location-independent income and leverage the rules correctly.
If this conversation has sparked a realization for you, if seeing the history of why the U.S. taxes citizens, or understanding the $130,000 FEIE shield made something click, you have to go deeper.
Highly recommend it.
Check out M. Rowe's resources. Her relocation blueprints and all her strategic insights are available at relocatewithrevenue.com. She is providing the exact roadmap for how to align your physical freedom with your financial reality.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought to process.
Okay, let's hear it.
We started this entire conversation by looking at that invisible siphon, that massive chunk of your income that vanishes before you can even touch it. We established that the system extracts this by default.
Right.
But now that you possess this knowledge, now that you understand territorial systems, the FEIE, and countries actively engineering visas for your demographic, your relationship to that extraction fundamentally changes.
Oh, I see exactly what you were saying. It's no longer something that is just happening to you.
Exactly. By knowing these structural options exist and choosing to stay put without even exploring them, your home country isn't just extracting your income by default anymore.
Because you know there's a way out.
By remaining passive, you're actively volunteering to pay it. You're consciously choosing to fund an antiquated system rather than optimize your own reality. So the question you need to ask yourself is this. If you legally reclaim that $35,000 and you woke up tomorrow with total geographic freedom, what is the very first thing you would change about your life?